So today we're going to be looking at Judges chapter 11. We're going to be carrying on in the book of Judges, and we're going to be looking at Jephthah. So we're going to be looking at Jephthah. So we kind of got introduced to a story at the beginning of last week, not necessarily to Jephthah, but to what was happening. If you remember at the end of chapter 10, it said that I just want to make sure I get it right. Is it Ammonites? Yes, Ammonites, not Amorites, although they might be interchangeable, depends on the translator. But Ammonites were coming against the people of Israel once again. First they were oppressing them that were on the east side of the Jordan, but now they were moving into the heart of Jewish territory, into the heart of Israel, and they were going to, there's a reason why one of the 10 Commandments is you shall not covet, because what they were doing is looking across at the land of Israel. They were coveting what the Israelites had, and they said, I'm going to go and I'm going to take it, right? This is just human history, and I think this is why it's so important. When you look at something like the 10 Commandments, it just makes so much sense as to why God gave us these rules, because it's like without these simple rules, we are just so chaotic. And we don't necessarily do what's in our own interest. But it says this about Jephthah. It says, Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty warrior. Remember that for later. He was a mighty warrior. And his father was Gilead. His mother was a prostitute. Also important. Gilead's wife also bore him sons. And when they were grown up, they drove Jephthah away. You are not going to get any of the inheritance in our family, they said, because you are a son of another woman. What does this sound like to you? When I was going through this, I couldn't help but think, this sounds like Abraham, doesn't it? Abraham sleeps with his wife's handmaid, right? This other woman, has the older son who does not inherit. Interesting. Now, in this case, right, the land of Israel has already been established. The allotments are given, even though he may not be a legitimate son, because another interesting thing about this, too, is that this woman who in the NIV is classified a prostitute, depending on your translation, might say concubine or something else, but it's most likely that this woman was not an Israelite. She was probably a Canaanite of some sort, like one of the Canaanites, because, one of the problems was, instead of going in and doing what the Lord had commanded them, instead they went in, they intermarried, they intermingled, and now, not only, and you're going to see why this is going to be such a big deal later on, but part of the problem is sometimes some undesirable traits end up coming into your way of life, into your family, and that seems to be something that's going to affect Jephthah later on. But for the meantime, we know that he was a Gileadite, he was a mighty warrior, so he was still recognized as officially a Israelite, right, because his father was. But he didn't get to take in any of the inheritance once his father died. So he fled from his brothers, this is verse 3, and he sheltered in the land of Tob, where a gang of scoundrels gathered around him and followed him. I love this too, because I got a vision of David, because David, of course, also gets run out of town, and then he forms a gang, but his is called his mighty men, not a gang of scoundrels. But it's very similar, right? They're both mighty warriors, and you're going to see why one is referred to as one way and why one is the other. Sometime later, when the Ammonites were fighting against Israel, the elders of Gilead went to get Jephthah from the land of Tob. Why? Because it says, they say, come and be our commander so we can fight the Ammonites. They knew he was a mighty warrior. They knew he was a tactician. They knew he knew how to organize an army. They knew he knew how to fight. And if you remember at the end of chapter 10, the nation of Israel had rallied. They had gathered together, getting ready to fight. But once they got there, they didn't know what to do. Wait a minute. How do we form ranks? How should we organize the military? How should we attack? Should we draw them in? What should we do? They didn't have any clue. And so they reach out to this man, Jephthah, that was one of them that they had drove away. And they say, be our commander, because they knew he was mighty. He had a reputation for victory, and he had a reputation for being good in combat. Verse 7, Jephthah said to them, didn't you hate me and drive me from my father's house? Why do you come to me now when you are in trouble? And the elders of Gilead said to him, nevertheless, we are turning to you now Come with us to fight the Ammonites, and you will be head over all of us who live in Gilead. So Jephthah answered, Suppose you take me back to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them to me. Will I really be your head? Fair enough question, right? You already ran me out once. You already drove me away from my inheritance and where I should have been. I don't even get to live in the land of my father because of what you've done. So how can I trust you? And the elders of Gilead replied, The Lord is our witness. We will certainly do as you say. So Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and commander over them. And he repeated all of his words before the Lord in Mizpah. Okay, so they bind themselves. They say, by the Lord, we will do this. This is a vow, and this is going to be important because there's going to be another vow that comes in. But there's a reason why the Lord, by the way, tells us not to make vows. Right? Do you remember what he says? He says, don't make a vow. Instead, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Just be a man of your word. Okay. Verse 12. And by the way, I'm reading a lot because I want to get through all this story because you need to see the story. It's kind of like we did it a couple weeks ago. I read a lot because I wanted to get through the story because the whole story together is what's important to see. It's important to understand this whole story as one piece. Then it says, Then Jephthah sent messengers to the Ammonite king with this question. What do you have against me that you have attacked my country? Fair question. Someone's marching an army against you. I'd kind of like to know why. What's interesting to me, though, is actually the answer. Is that it says, the king of the Ammonites answered Jephthah's messengers, When Israel came up out of Egypt, they took away my land from the Arnon to Jabbok, these are two rivers, all the way to the Jordan. Now give it back peaceably, right? Surrender to us, allow us to have our land back. This is their grievance. But Jephthah, being raised Jewish, right, because it seems that it wasn't until the time of his father passing, right, because that's when you divvy up the inheritance. It wasn't until the time of his father's passing that he was driven away from the family. So being that he was the oldest boy, he was likely raised up in good Jewish tradition. He would have known the history. He would have been taught the Torah, and he would have been very familiar with the story of the wandering through the desert. Right, all of the book of Numbers. And so this is his response. Jephthah sent back messengers to the Ammonite king saying, This is what Jephthah says. Israel did not take the land of Moab or the land of the Ammonites, but when they came up out of Egypt, so if you know the geography, right, so there's the Red Sea is kind of like a big sea that kind of makes an inlet into the land, and the two lands border. There's, I think, is it Moab or Edom, one of the two, borders Egypt. And so if they were going to go by land route, they would have had to trespass into someone else's territory. But that's not the way they went, is it? Instead, they crossed by the Red Sea. They went through the sea and on to Kadesh. Then Israel sent messengers to the king of Edom, saying, Give us permission to move through your country. But the king of Edom would not listen. And they also sent to the king of Moab, and he refused. So Israel stayed at Kadesh. Instead of moving north into the land, right, they instead had to skirt all the way around. And we know this. If you've gone through the book of Numbers, you know they didn't take the most direct path. In fact, they took a big curve around. And that's what Jephthah is getting at here. Next, they traveled through the wilderness, skirted the lands of Edom and Moab, all the way down across the southern border. For you guys, I guess it's this way, towards the east. And they came to the... Oh, man, I lost my place. 19. Then the Israel sent messengers... Next they traveled the wilderness through Edom and Moab, passed along the eastern side of the country of Moab, and camped on the other side of the Arnon. Okay, so now they've moved on, and now they found a new country. And it says they didn't enter the territory of Moab, for Arnon was its border, so they kind of kept along the bottom, and now they're moving north. And it says then they came to Shihon. So then Israel sent messengers to Shihon, king of the Amorites. This is why I said the names might actually be interchangeable depending on the translator, because it seems that sometimes they're referred to as Ammonites and sometimes they're referred to as Amorites. I'm not sure why that is, but it's a thing. Anyway, so they send messengers to the king of the Amorites, who ruled in Heshbon, and he said to him, "Let us pass through your country to our own place." They still have no beef with them. They don't want to have a fight. Hey, we just want safe passage through your territory. Sihon, however, did not trust Israel, and unlike the other kings, he didn't trust Israel to pass through his territory, so instead he musters his troops and encamped at Jahaz and fought with Israel. Instead of, like how Edom and Moab just said, well, we don't trust you, and they just let them move around. Instead, this guy goes, we don't trust you, and we're going to attack you to make sure you don't violate our trust. Then the Lord, the God of Israel, gave Sihon and his whole army into Israel's hands, and they defeated them. Israel took over the land of the Amorites that lived in that country, capturing all of it from the Arnon to Jabbok, from the desert of the Jordan. They weren't conquerors. They arrived, they looked for safe passage, and then the Lord gave it to them because they attacked. Now since the Lord, the God of Israel, has driven the Amorites out before his people in Israel, what right have you to take it over? Will you not take, this is a great question, will you not take what your God, Chemosh, gives you? Likewise, whatever the Lord our God has given us, we will possess. Are you any better than Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab? Did he ever quarrel with Israel or fight with them? For 300 years Israel has occupied Heshbon, Aor, and the surrounding settlements of all the towns of the Arnon. Why didn't you retake them during that time? I have not wronged you, but you are doing me wrong by waging war against me. Let the Lord, the judge, decide the dispute this day between the Israelites and the Ammonites. And then the king of Ammon, however, paid no attention to that message that Jephthah had sent them. And so we're seeing, once again, just like his ancestors, he's giving the illusion he wants to talk, but he's not really interested in talking. Now, this is where the dangerous thing of his mother being a Canaanite comes into play. Remember that all the way back at the beginning? It says, then the Spirit of the Lord came onto Jephthah, good thing, and he crossed the Gilead and Manasseh and passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from there he advanced against the Ammonites. The Lord was with him as he went forward, and the Lord was going to give into his hand the Ammonites. But then what does he do? Verse 30. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord. And what did the Lord tell him not to do? Don't make a vow. Don't do it, but he does it anyway. And the vow he makes is the dumbest, stupidest vow anyone could ever make. I don't know why I got tickled now. If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. Now, as a 21st century person, we read this coming out of your house, you're thinking, of course it's going to be a human. What else is going to come out of your house? Now, let's broaden this out for the sake of Jephthah. Let's say he meant his estate. It still isn't a wise thing to do to say, whatever's the first thing I come across, I'm going to kill for you. Because you don't know what it is. This, of course, was a pagan practice. This was very common in a lot of the different pagan religions that surrounded Israel at the time. Generals and commanders would often make this vow to their God. And so as far as Jephthah was concerned, he was just doing the normal thing. But this is, of course, what I was talking about earlier. This happens even today, where we allow dangerous practices that we don't even think about. It's just like, oh, it's so normal in our culture today, and we don't even bother to look and say, is it even in here? Is it even in the Word? Should I even consider it valid? Because if the Bible doesn't consider it valid, it doesn't matter how normal it is in the culture. It isn't valid. This practice of committing the first thing that came out of your door, that was valid in that culture. But it was never valid to the Lord. Then, of course, what happens? Jephthah went over and he fought the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into his hands. Why? Because that was what the Lord was going to do anyway. He was already there. This is what was going to happen. And he devastated 20 towns from Aror to the vicinity of Minnith as far as Abel Keramim. Thus Israel subdued Ammon. Israel was victorious. God had shown up just like he had done time and time again. Because if you remember at the end of chapter 10, what was it? He was grieving at the pain of his children as he watched them being oppressed. And so he was going to send them a deliverer one way or another. But then, verse 34, when Jephthah returned home to his home in Mizpah, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of timbrels? She was only a child. And except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. It was his only kid. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and he cried, "Oh no, my daughter, you have brought me down and I am devastated. I have made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." Two things. This is why it was the dumbest, stupidest, most idiotic thing you could ever do. Why would you ever make that kind of vow? And the second thing is, yes, he can break that vow. You'll see on there, Hannah, if you can put up Leviticus chapter 27. It says this: the Lord said to Moses. Now, for many of you, of course, I know Leviticus is your favorite book and you absolutely love going through it time and time again. It's not at all boring. But this is important. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, if anyone makes a special vow," sounds familiar, "to dedicate a person to the Lord by giving the equivalent value instead." So as a substitute, instead of giving the person, you could give this value. "Set the value of male between the ages of 20 and 60 at 50 shekels of silver, according to the sanctuary shekel. And for a female, set her value at 30 shekels. And for a person," now remember, this was only a child, so this is a young girl. So it's not even this 30 shekels. It says, for a person between the ages of 5 and 20, a male is 20 shekels, and a female is 10 shekels. He could pay 10 shekels and break the vow. This is going to be important for a little bit of a discussion after. So verse 36, back to Judges. Verse 36 says, "My father," she replied, "you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you have promised, now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites. But grant me this one request," she said. "Give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends, because I will never marry." "You may go," he said, and he let her go for 2 months. She and her friends went into the hills and wept because she would never marry. Then after the 2 months, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed, and she was a virgin. From this comes the Israelite tradition that each year the young women of Israel go out 4 days to commemorate the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite. Now, there's two things about this. First off, on a cursory reading, if you're just a normal human being, you're going through this, you're reading, what does he do to his daughter? Yeah, he sacrifices her, right? Because it says, and he does as he said. But I'll just present it for the sake of argument, because either way, I don't actually think this particular detail isn't as important. But there is an argument that that's not what happened. That in fact, he could have paid the temple tax, he could have paid the 10 shekels, but because she was completely dedicated to the Lord, she would have never been allowed to marry anyway. And so this whole weeping for marriage and stuff like that, it all makes sense. She was committed to the Lord. She was never going to be able to have children of her own. She was never going to be able to be a fully recognized woman in Jewish society. And so and part of the reason for this is because later on in the Bible, Jephthah is actually recognized as a hero of faith. And people say, well, and so the scholarly argument is, well, how could he be called a hero of faith if he ends up conducting human sacrifice, which we know the Bible tells us God abhors. It is an abomination. It is a terrible, terrible thing. And that Jephthah actually probably would have been, according to the law, if he would have sacrificed his daughter, he would have had to have been stoned to death. So there is an argument whether or not it happened. I don't think that's the most important detail that we pull out of this. I think the most important thing is this. We need to lean on wisdom, and we need to know our Bible. Because if Jephthah clearly knew a lot of his Bible, didn't he? He knew the Torah pretty well. He knew it well enough that when he's talking to this king, he was able to spout out all this stuff from Numbers. But he didn't know it well enough that when God says, don't make a vow, instead live by this, let your yes be yes and your no be no. If he would have known that, if he would have had that burned onto his heart, then his daughter never would have had to become a victim of his poor judgment and his terrible lack of wisdom. And friends, we have to be worried about this too, because there are things that become so normal in the culture that we bring them into the church and we don't even think to question it, just like Jephthah did. That is our warning today. Is there something that we haven't even questioned? We didn't even bother asking the question, wait, is this biblical? Does the Bible ask us to do this? Does the Bible command us to do this? Does the Bible require us to do this? Because if it doesn't, maybe we shouldn't be. Or on the flip side, sometimes we actually allow things that have become cultural to actually push us off of doing things that God has actually called us to do. One of my favorite examples of this is meditation. God constantly is calling us to prayer and meditation. And the problem is, when we think of meditation, the cultural idea of meditation is taken over, where we think of some hippie sitting there cross-legged and they got to clear their mind and have nothing in there. And no, that was never what meditation was. Meditation was always about that somber silence, but about sitting and focusing, thinking, pondering, meditating on the Word. To grow in understanding, to think on the Word, and to listen for the voice of the Lord. These are things that we ought to do. We ought to meditate, just not the way that our culture tells us to do it. We should look to the Word to guide us in these things, to help us avoid making terrible mistakes. Now, and I originally had wrote that, we make the same mistakes today. Maybe we're not outright killing children today, but there are churches constantly, and you can find it very easily, going out and saying, God is pro-choice. He's okay with the killing of babies because it's become so normal in our culture, and they find it so easy to twist the Scripture that they no longer even see that God values human life. They forget the book of Jeremiah, where he says, even when you're in the womb, I know you. As we go from this place and as we go to a time of prayer, I just want us to keep that in mind, because it's certainly something that has bothered me in my time, because I know that when I certainly was a new Christian, and even still sometimes today, things will come across to me, and it's not always my first reflex to ask, is this biblical? But we need to condition ourselves to ask this question. Wait, is this in the Bible? Do I find this? Should I be doing this? Or, if it is in the Bible, am I doing it the biblical way? Because there is a right way and a wrong way. And if we live the right way, if we follow Jesus and we put ourselves on that path, right, then things are going to come well for us. But a lot of times we sit there and we cry out and we say, Lord, where are you? Why aren't you here with me? And it turns out, because as Jesus said too, you pray to me, but you're praying wrong. Your heart isn't right, and it's because we don't know the Word. This is why, by the way, I like to go through the Bible book by book, verse by verse. I like to actually go through and see, what does the Bible say? I don't want to get up here and give you my opinion. I don't want to get up here and tell you what I think the Word says. I want you to read and see what the Word says itself.